Hey everybody, hey, it's Mr. Horser. I'm back again. Hey, thought I'd try this screen a little bit differently. I'm going to start off with the window being open and sharing. So this week is chapter 16, and chapter 16 has to deal with some managing resources. A large portion of what you're going to read here in this chapter is very academic. Let me explain why. And so a good portion of this chapter is going to cover what's called the X Windows system. And you're going to say, what the hell is an X Windows system? Well, you know how when you create a when you use a graphical user interface with, say, Windows, and we have a window, and then we have like a title bar, and then we have scroll bars, and we can move things around. Well, that's a Windows system, right? And when Linux was created and stuff, and they were starting to get going and stuff, a lot of people wanted the ability to create their own graphical user interface, and hence X Windows systems were kind of created. There's a couple of versions, the X386, or the X.org and stuff versions and stuff that people can go out there. But the reality is that you and I are going to spend a lot of our time, probably none of our time and stuff, making a graphical user interface. Now that most Linux distributions come with a graphical user interface to work with. But if you imagine, way back when and stuff, when Linux was just getting off the ground, a lot of it was command line interface. Okay, so they didn't have a GUI to kind of go with it, and a lot of people were complaining that, yeah, it's not very good unless you can have a GUI. And the GUI just makes it more convenient, more contemporary. Okay, that's out there. So anyway, like I said, when you go through this, now the later part of the chapter down here is going to talk about super users and KDE super users and stuff. Now those are important elements and stuff. So those are commands that are good because you're going in and out of the controls as the administrator when you want to do certain types of commands. And also there's going to be a section towards the end about quotas. Okay, quotas dealing with a user or a group. A quota in this case would be like a drive space. Okay, if I had access to the server at school and I wanted to provide a drive space for each one of you as students, I could assign that as a quota to each individual student, okay? And I can determine, or I could assign it as a group and say everybody in the group gets X amount to share with, or maybe because there's 5 groups in this class, I could allocate, a certain size for each individual group, and then you guys have to stay within those kind of limits and stuff. So that's actually some good things. I mean, there's a lot of companies that like to restrict the hard disk or the space that are being used by the employees, just so they can manage their resources. Okay. Overall, again, the chapter 16, what their title is Managing Resources in Linux. So hopefully that kind of helps a little bit. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here, and I'll end my recording. You guys have a great day.